Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today I'm delighted to speak with Rob Abbott, CEO at ISPOR. That's the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, which is a global professional society for health economics and outcomes research, or HEOR. ISPOR was established in 1995 and has been growing ever since. There are now 20,000 members active in more than 100 countries. I wanted to have Rob on the show today to talk about HEOR and its value proposition in life sciences, particularly for listeners at startups and earlier stage companies who may not be as familiar as large pharma is with HEOR and ISPOR, and I suspect Rob will make this case during our conversation, they absolutely should be. We'll learn how to set up an HEOR program, how it can help companies attract investors, current trends in HEOR, and how it's changing in light of emerging technology like AI, and what's on ISPOR's agenda in the near future. Thank you so much for being here, Rob.
Ben, you've just done an extraordinary job of introducing myself and the topic. It's a great pleasure to be here on behalf of ISPOR. And I really look forward to sharing some of the insights that we have from a health economics and outcomes research perspective with your listeners, particularly as you suggest, those listeners that are actively engaged with a small to mid-size or indeed early stage biotech. I think there's a lot that ISPOR and HEOR have to offer those kinds of companies as they clarify their value proposition and really seek to explain themselves to audiences, including investor audiences that may not otherwise be as familiar with health economics and outcomes research and the value that it can help to provide.
That's excellent. And I want to jump right to that. But first, before we do, I want to get to know you a little bit better, Rob. You have a diverse set of background experiences. I'll ask you maybe, what are some of the through lines that connect those various experiences? You've worked in nonprofits, you've worked at a private company, you've worked in government. Tell us a little bit about, your approach to your career and what circumstances led you to the CEO role at ISPOR.
No, I really appreciate this opportunity because when I look back on my career, and to a certain extent, I view my current role with ISPOR as something of a capstone of sorts. I look back on my career and I realize that from the outside looking in, it might seem as though I've made some rather bizarre choices because at various stages, I could very comfortably have settled in and climbed the proverbial ladder in government or in the management consulting community or the not-for-profit community. Instead, I very intentionally chose to move around because I wanted to look at particular issues and opportunities from multiple perspectives. But the through line, what unites all of this is that I have had a very long-standing interest in human welfare and how we actually improve human welfare globally. And that has expressed itself through work that I've done related to corporate social responsibility. It's expressed itself through work that I've done as the CEO of the Canadian Genetic Diseases Network and the Canadian Gene Cure Foundation. It's expressed itself through the work that I've done as a management consulting, working for and on behalf of health policy change. But I think the common denominator is that for me, the relationship between social responsibility on the one hand and business viability on the other, or how we craft policy that's smart policy that actually improves human welfare. These are the things that are exciting to me. These are the things that make me want to get out of bed in the morning and show up for work.
Well, it's an important role, maybe particularly right now in the U.S. Let's get into health economics and outcomes research for listeners who may not be as familiar with what it is. Can you give us a kind of top line explanation of HEOR, and listeners bear with us, there's some acronyms we're going to be using throughout this conversation. Refer back, to the beginning of the episode if you need to, but HEOR, health economics and outcomes research, what is it? What value can it bring to life sciences companies?
So I'm going to try and keep the acronyms to a minimum, and simply say that health economics and outcomes research is a multidisciplinary field, firstly, and that will become, I think, more interesting to the listeners as we get deeper into this conversation. Because when you start thinking about, well, I need to bootstrap an HEOR department at my small biotech, where do I get started? It's not as though you have to hire someone that did a degree in health economics necessarily. The reality is that as a multidisciplinary field, yes, there are economists working here, but so are there epidemiologists and statisticians and others. So, first things first, HEOR is a multidisciplinary field that uses data to inform decision making in healthcare. So that's the headline. Multidisciplinary relies on data to inform decision making in healthcare. Now, if we drop down just a little bit, the idea is to think about cost effectiveness, real world effectiveness, and patient centered value. These are kind of the three big things. Is it cost effective? Does it actually do what we thought it would do? And what is the patient experience in all of this? Not only in terms of the efficacy of the drug or the service, but the ease of use, et cetera. So, this is very much what is at the heart of health economics and outcomes research.
And you've talked about this multidisciplinary practice. You also said you don't necessarily need a health economics or health economist hired on to start up an HEOR program at a startup at an early stage company. How do you start one up? How do you, a company that's hearing you right now and thinking, wow, I'd really like to be able to, better elucidate the value of my products, make the case, to governments, to payers, make sure that, our medicine is understand in terms of what it means to individual patients. How do you get started with that? And if there's anything else, Rob, you might say just about the kind of business case, for someone at a small company who's saying, I really think we should get started on HEOR here, and here's why.
So, yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say to the listeners, Ben, is I think that HEOR is crucial, and it has to be viewed, especially from the perspective of a startup or a small to mid-sized biotech. It has to be viewed, strategically, and it has to be scaled appropriately, because I know from firsthand experience that resources are tight, data is limited, and the priorities generally are focused on proving the science and securing funding. Like, this is what kind of
Progressing the
drives
asset,
this
right?
is what like this is what drives the day-to-day business. Now, I do want to just foreshadow something that I hope we get a chance to talk about in a few minutes, which is all about the investor perspective and how HEOR can support de-risking and valuing the asset that is the biotech. But before we get there, I would just say that as a small biotech, you need to understand that payers, investors, prospective business partners, they want evidence of value, not just efficacy. So the mantra that I routinely say is, you've got to think beyond approval. approval is a necessary but insufficient condition for success. So health economics and outcomes research can, help shape smarter development. It can help reduce risk. It can attract investment, but again, you have to kind of approach this, thoughtfully and strategically. It can strengthen the value proposition. So, in particular, I would say health economics and outcomes research can help quantify, unmet need and the economic burden of disease, which, directly translates into prospective future business value. And early modeling, particularly cost of illness studies, burden of disease analysis, can justify the relevance of a drug or a medical device to prospective investors and partners. So that's kind of just the beginning of where HEOR may start to become more relevant for an early stage biotech.
Yeah, and I think your comment about launch or excuse me, approval essentially being table stakes is an important one, especially given, the data we've seen on just how unpredictable success can be with newly launched products. Something like 50% of newly launched products are not meeting their forecast. I think, which just shows how important, proving the value of a product to a whole lot of different stakeholders, might be. Uh, yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And I think the thing too for listeners is that this can sometimes seem like this mountain that you have to climb. And I would say, look, you can break it down. If you're an early stage biotech that's raising capital, especially beyond Series A, let's say, the first order of business is have some basic health economics and outcomes research materials at hand. And I'm thinking of things like cost of illness or burden of disease studies, the payer landscape or pricing strategy, um, and probably a reasonably clear sense of what the economic endpoints look like. Like that's kind of the foundational piece. You can then build on that and basically say, okay, when I'm talking about health economics and outcomes research, I'm going to be talking about it with an investor in mind. And so, can I show, and this is a test for all of your listeners in early stage biotech right now, can I show that I understand how value, not efficacy, but how value is assessed? Because that's different from efficacy. And if I'm in the pre-revenue stage, health economics and outcomes research can be a proxy of sorts for prospective commercial traction. Then ultimately you need to have a sense of how I can show, a pathway to real world validation. So, what are my plans for patient reported outcomes, real world evidence generation, and post launch data collection? So, you can kind of break it down into those three stages, let's say. But and the first order of business is probably one of saying, wait a minute, like what is, ultimately, what is the health outcome for dollars spent, and how is our product or service going to shape that positively? I mean, there are a number of things that HEOR brings to a biotech, in my opinion. I think it can serve as a bridge between clinical innovation on the one hand and market success on the other. I think it can help to justify pricing and gain access. But at the end of the day, it's like, what is the health outcome per dollar spend? And can this product or service, positively shape that? And you get to begin answering that question when you have the cost of illness or burden of disease studies in hand. when you kind of understand what the payer landscape looks like, when you have a better sense for what those economic endpoints might be.
Right. And so when should a company get started on this? So I'm thinking of maybe it's a preclinical company, transitioning from animal studies into their first in human trial, or maybe it's a company that's, moving into a phase two or even a phase three. Or, I guess my question is, do you want to start this process of developing your HEOR, dossier for lack of a better word, but your group of HEOR information, data, and documents. Do you want to start doing that once you know or fairly certain that you've landed on a product that you're going to take all the way into late stages and hopefully approval? Or is this something that should start, even earlier, even at the very earliest preclinical stages?
So my bias here is that you want to be starting as early as possible. There is an adage that you begin with the end in mind. And so I think you want to be thinking about, okay, what are those foundational pieces of work? I mean, I've spoken of cost of illness or burden of disease studies and so forth. You want to be thinking about that early on. Like, what is it? What is the science that we're pursuing? What is this company being built around? What is the disease that we're targeting? And what is the outcome that we hope to achieve from a health improvement perspective? Certainly. But what is the outcome we hope to achieve from a business perspective? You've got to be thinking about those things early on. Because if you wait too long, you're not going to have the time to generate the real evidence. Because this is the other thing that I find fascinating is that uh, in any biotech's journey, there is a stage where you are in an iterative dialogue with partners or investors. And the investors have a whole series of questions, and they don't all come at the same time. But those questions have a lot to do with, is there a clear pricing and reimbursement pathway? Is there strong market differentiation? Is there proof of value to stakeholders? Is there an understanding of real world use? Is there a sustainable and scalable, commercial model? Now, those are different questions, but they're all legitimate questions that investors have. And I will say the good news is that health economics and outcomes research can help you answer those questions because if someone's concerned about pricing and reimbursement, for instance, we might say, okay, here's our budget impact analysis or early insights we have from payers. We've done that homework. And it's not one and done. It is iterative. We're back and forth with payers, or we're back and forth in terms of the budget impact analysis, but we've at least got something. Or we might say, here's our comparative, cost effectiveness work. Or here's what we have in terms of patient reported outcomes and the burden of illness data. So for most investor questions, there is an HEOR signal or an HEOR response that fits, but you can't wait until you're, at stage two clinical trials to start answering these questions. You've got to start early.
So, is this something that, each individual company needs to, and I guess what I'm thinking about here is, are there shortcuts to this? Are there shared resources that ISPOR can provide, or does each individual company, given their very different products, different therapeutic areas, different drug mechanisms, is it something that they have to think about and build themselves, or are there tools, resources, that ISPOR can provide, to help them?
So the short answer is yes, and so on the one hand, I don't want to convey the impression that, one size fits all and, all companies, especially biotech companies, are the same and so forth. Having said that, um, ISPOR is increasingly creating a body of resources, a body of evidence, if you will, that particularly small and early stage biotech would find enormous value in. So, I appreciate that there are, a large number of studies that ISPOR has been involved in that, and we have those on our website or we have those readily available for folks. And by the way, I'm increasingly interested in hearing from the biotech community because I would actually like to grow the number of biotech companies that are part of our ISPOR. But certainly, we have some resources that can help to sort of smooth out that learning curve a little bit. And it's true that because companies are driven by different boards of directors or different motivations, they're going to have a nuance to their strategy that needs to be respected. So there's a little bit of bespoke work that individual companies will at some stage inevitably need to do. But there's also a lot of work that ISPOR has that we can make available.
I want to just circle back to something you said earlier, and this is sort of continuing on what we're talking about here, and this appealing to investors, the financial benefits or value benefits of doing HEOR. I can hear in the back of my head some listeners saying, "Well, I'd love to have a robust HEOR program, but I'm trying to keep the lights on right now." How do what's your argument to a company that says essentially, you're gonna, if you make this investment, and maybe give me a sense of like what that early investment might be, but if I'm willing to make this investment in collecting this HEOR, how does it come back to me? What's the ROI on creating an HEOR program as an early
Yes.
stage company?
Well, so again, just to be really transparent, it won't be lost on some of your listeners that over the last 2 years, let's say, there has been very significant consolidation, quote unquote, within global biopharma with respect to HEOR. And I know that any global biopharma C-suite representatives that might be listening would say, okay, hang on, we haven't gotten rid of the HEOR function. We've simply redistributed it or rearticulated it in various ways. And there's absolutely some truth to that. But the underlying argument, I think, and I've written about this and spoken about this. I think that the HEOR community has actually not done itself any favors historically because we've been so focused on the methods and the curation of evidence that we haven't necessarily connected all of the dots and demonstrated how that evidence does generate an ROI. We've basically said, look, this is, we've done our work. It's now over to our market access colleagues or our whatever, colleagues in medical affairs to, carry the ball forward. And I think that we can and need to do a little better than that. So, although I don't have a definitive answer today, I do want all of your listeners to know that ISPOR is currently sponsoring, a piece of empirical quantitative research that is focused very squarely on the ROI of HEOR. Typically, HEOR practitioners, whether they're in the private sector or elsewhere, we've operated to a certain extent like academics. And so we point to, oh, well, we published this many papers or we've done this many studies and that sort of thing. Honestly, investors and C-suite executives don't care as much about that sort of thing. That might be a necessary but insufficient set of conditions. They actually care about the fact that, okay, if I'm spending $50 million a year as a global biopharma company on HEOR, what am I getting on the other end? Because I can say with some certainty that if I spend that same amount on, advertising or marketing and communications, I can measure, what that return is. We're not there yet with HEOR. Generally, whether it's small, mid, or large scale. But I know that the work we're currently sponsoring is going to contribute pretty significantly to, I think, a refreshed debate about the business value of HEOR. Now, in the meantime, for the early stage or startup biotechs that are listening, I would say, look, if you want to understand some of those foundational things that I mentioned earlier, the cost of illness or the burden of disease, for instance, you should reach out to ISPOR. And we can, I don't want to suggest that we're in a position yet as a not-for-profit to become your fractional HEOR department. But I think in many respects, some of the resources that we have can help to bridge that gap. So, it's a complex and layered question when we start talking about the value. I think the most important thing, as it usually is just to begin, to get started. And for the early stage or startups, then I would suggest, hey, don't fight this drama as if you're all alone. Reach out to us. Like, we are the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research. If you reach out to us, we have an interest in helping you. And chances are some of the questions the early stage, biotechs have, we've probably already answered many of those questions.
Right. Right. ISPOR's science strategy identifies on an ongoing basis emerging themes that impact HEOR and how it's used. ISPOR also publishes a top 10 trends report. There have been a lot of technological changes, just for one example, since 1995 when the organization began.
Yes.
What are some of those topics or technologies that ISPOR has identified as being important to, collecting and using HEOR effectively now?
So I'm gonna maybe mention three things, and can expand on any of them as we see fit. Um, no surprise, artificial intelligence, and the use of artificial intelligence in health economics and outcomes research. Obviously, the use of AI in healthcare decision making more generally, massively important trend, quote unquote. At the same time, real world evidence and the use of real world evidence to inform decision making. What's most interesting to me, though, Ben, is the third big trend that I think has been gathering a lot of momentum, is patient-centered research and patient centricity. Now, patient centricity is one of those things. It's a little bit like corporate social responsibility. Everybody likes to talk about it, but when you get right down to it, I think that patient centricity is fundamentally important, and it's not well understood. I think there is a lot of what I would characterize as tokenism that takes
Hmm.
place under the umbrella of patient centricity. And I think it's really important for all companies, but especially for early stage companies, to think about patient centered work as a strategic business decision, and to understand that patients and the views that patients have are every bit as important, if not more so, than what that health economist down the hallway might have to say or what that statistician might have to say. So, in my mind, we're going to continue to hear a lot about artificial intelligence. And to be sure, helping with systematic literature reviews, synthesizing data, helping to tailor treatment protocols and so forth. I think there's a lot of promise there, to be sure. And we still need human intelligence to complement that. With real world evidence, we're kind of getting more into the realm of patient centricity because we're basically saying, what has the actual experience with that drug or medical device been? What are patients actually telling us? What are we seeing from electronic health records and so forth? And then we get into patient centricity writ large. And this is where I see tremendous opportunity because, and I know some of the early stage biotechs that are listening might be going, yeah, but that's like down the road. I'm an early stage biotech. Like, how important is this for me? And I would say, look, by engaging patients early and often, because it's an iterative process, you're going to heighten your possibilities of designing better drugs, running smarter trials, building trust and differentiation, and ultimately accelerating market access and adoption. So, the patient centricity piece as a trend for me is hugely important because I think done well, that can be a game changer. And I think that there's, even in this rather interesting climate in which we find ourselves in the US and elsewhere, quite honestly, I think there's an appetite for listening to patients in ways that we haven't historically. And I think that for those companies that do it well, it holds tremendous promise.
Do you think that technology is playing a role in helping to improve this, real patient-centered research approach? Obviously, there's, the ePro that's been out now for a few years, electronic patient-reported outcomes. I wonder if you have a sense, Rob, of if more companies are starting to incorporate that into their trials, if you're seeing any sort of trend, I hope that's moving up toward more. I don't know though. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of how patient-centered research is being conducted in the context of a clinical trial, and whether there is emerging technology that can help with that?
So I think I would say maybe five things. I think that yes, overall the arrow is pointing upward in terms of increased awareness, understanding, and use, dare I say, if that's the right word, for patient-centered research and patient-centered work. And the five things I wanted to highlight would be validating unmet need. This is especially prevalent in rare diseases because patients define success, often anyway, quite differently than regulators or physicians. And so validating unmet need is one important area that we're actually seeing, change around. Informing target product profiles and development strategies. So what features matter most to a patient? Is it the mode of administration? So it makes it, ultimately you need to know whether this injectable drug that you're working on is actually going to matter to the patient. If the patient actually prefers a pill, that's a problem. And you want to hear about that early. And the same would be true for, frequency of dosage, tolerability, that sort of thing. So, informing TPPs and development strategy is a sort of second area in which patient-centered engagement is starting to change. Of course, enhancing clinical trial design. Are there barriers to participation? Are we articulating meaningful endpoints? Are we seeing, patient-reported outcomes that are truly, meaningful and material? Building trust. And I would say building trust and possibly even building, advocacy and advocates, because patients, alongside their experience and their expertise, if you can get patients advocating on behalf of your product, advocating on behalf of your company. I mean, that's gold, and that's gold to the company. It's gold to prospective investors and partners. And then ultimately, I think patient engagement, is very actively linked to what I would broadly characterize as payer and HTA engagement. So, how do we actually do this, and what are we seeing? Well, I think what I'm observing is that patient advisory boards, qualitative work, and that can include one-on-one interviews with individual patients or patient groups, surveys and social listening sessions, protocol design. These are all things that are happening now, and the sort of how to do it piece is, again, you have to start early. And by the way, I spoke to an investor last year, and his company does not invest in companies that are not actively engaging patients at that early stage, because it's really a signal, I think, of the attitude and approach that the company itself has. Like, if you place the patient truly at the center of what you're doing, then you're going to engage them early to help shape the trajectory of the drug or the product that you're developing. And being respectful in terms of, hey, are you compensating patients for their participation? Are you creating multiple pathways for them to participate? And also, you have to, as a company, you have to realize that patient engagement is an iterative process. This is not a check the box. Okay, I spoke to these patients at this stage and we're done. No, you circle back, and you want to be targeted as well. Like, you really want to be thinking, and this comes back to thinking about this in a strategic business context. You want to come back to, okay, what is the burden of disease? What are the endpoints? What is the usability of the drug or the device, and so forth? How do patients perceive this? So, again, there's just an element of how how aware am I as an early stage biotech, or a late stage biotech for that matter? How aware am I of who my customer, quote unquote, ultimately is? That's the population I need to be in communication with.
Right. I want to ask a question before we move on real world evidence, which is not a new idea. It's been around for a number of years now, and I remember a time period. It's probably been 5 or 6 years ago where there was a lot of excitement about anonymizing patient data, from big health insurers. Optum, for example, created a group where they had, millions and millions of patient records based on claims data. And the idea was, this is going to open up a brand new area of research where we can really understand, not just the safety and efficacy of a drug, but, a patient with a comorbidity and how this drug's going to impact them. All these different things outside of a traditional clinical trial could potentially be gleaned by doing deep analysis on things like claims data. I'm curious to get your thoughts, Rob, on kind of the state of real world evidence right now. It's easy to imagine that AI could absolutely revolutionize the use of real
Yeah.
world evidence, by making the analysis, a lot faster and more comprehensive. But give me your sense, if you don't mind, on, maybe some of the ways that it's being used now, how it's changed, I guess, in the last few years.
Okay, so that's a that's a PhD dissertation kind of question, but it's a great question, and I would say that uh, as the CEO of ISPOR, I can respond from a, let's say, general level. I would quickly add, and I say this really as an invitation to any of the listeners. We have within our membership at ISPOR most, if not all, of the world's leading experts on real world evidence, particularly in the context of healthcare decision making. So rest assured that if there is a nuanced question about real world evidence, we have within our membership, the people that can answer that question. This also, by the way, allows me to put a plug in for the fact that ISPOR is actually convening a real world evidence summit later this month in Tokyo, actually, because of the importance of real world evidence within the Asia Pacific region. So I think that real world evidence has been um, very, very consistently in the top three trends that we have been tracking for many, many years now as part of our top 10 trends work. I think it's important for listeners to note that we actually at ISPOR release a top 10 trends report every 2 years. And for several iterations now, real world evidence has been in the top three. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that, okay, the clinical trial gives us critical insights in terms of the efficacy of a drug. And that's fundamental in terms of ultimate approval and access to the market. Real world evidence, though, is the backbone of the outcomes research piece of HEOR, because this is where we actually, with very clear intention, get the patient experience, whether that's through electronic health records, whether that's through patient reported outcomes, whether that's through individual interviews and so forth. And so I would say real world evidence has been accelerating. I think that there is increased acceptance that real world evidence needs to be and be seen to be as important as the outcomes of the clinical trial itself. At a minimum, it needs to be seen to be complementary. I'm not saying we're there yet, but real world evidence is likely going to be alongside AI and patient-centered research. This is something that's going to be with us and viewed with increasing importance over the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. I want to move on. I have a question about health technology assessment, Rob. You've worked at the nonprofit Health Technology Assessment International. It's HTA, it's unlike many global regulators outside of the US, the FDA does not, consider HTA or doesn't have a formalized HTA program as a component of drug approval or of decision making generally. But we have seen in recent years private insurers, increasingly using HTA-like information to make coverage decisions, collaborating in some cases with groups like ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. My question is, do you think, Rob, that FDA or CMS in the context of Medicare and Medicaid should consider formally adopting an HTA framework, underscored, of course, by the quality adjusted life year? What are your thoughts there?
So that's on the one hand, that's a great question, Ben. It's also, a loaded question because I know that, many of my colleagues have very strong opinions on this. I think I would say the following, and it is important, I suppose, to acknowledge what the FDA's current remit is, and the reality is that that current remit really doesn't extend into the evaluation of quality. I mean, it's very much centered around efficacy.
Or
Now,
cost. It doesn't
you know,
talk,
yeah,
the FDA does not talk about cost or economics, right?
what I would suggest, but it's become a very live and important conversation, especially as the U.S. administration has talked about international reference pricing and a host of other approaches to drug pricing, and I think in the wake of the executive order in particular that came out in May around reference pricing, Some of my colleagues have said, look, there are probably better approaches that could be taken, and that's where HTA has started to emerge as a prospective option. I think what I would say is that historically the United States has not necessarily been friendly towards the concept of HTA for a number of reasons. Uh, we don't necessarily need to debate those reasons right now. I think that there's a renewed interest in what this could look like. And I'm glad you mentioned our friends at ICER because I think they would say, well, we're kind of doing this.
Right.
And I think that that's a good platform and a good place to begin because what I would suggest is that the FDA and CMS, would benefit from closer collaboration with HTA and payer bodies, better alignment on data needs, and promotion of value-based evidence generation. And that can happen, without any change to the, remit of the FDA and CMS. Like that can happen right now. So I think what I would suggest is that rather than jumping straight to, the FDA should formally adopt or, I would just say, actually, there's room and space right now to collaborate, more closely, with HTA bodies and payers and align around some common gaps. And that then could, establish a foundation for, further work that could be done down the road that could conceivably lead to something more formal. I think that I would not want to advocate, an immediate shift towards formal adoption.
Yeah, and I agree with you that we don't have anywhere close to the time to get into the pros and cons of a quality adjusted life year, but I will just mention because ICER ran into this and I believe has worked on their methodology to try to improve it. But just one example, rare disease patients have criticized, the quality adjusted life year calculation, used by
Yeah.
regulators like IQWiG in Germany or NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in England, which of course provides guidance, on drug coverage to the National Health Service. But rare disease patients, have said the quality metric doesn't adequately consider drug attributes that are meaningful for patients. Getting back to this,
Yeah.
patient
Yeah.
directed
Yeah.
research. So, we won't debate the quality, but I will ask you, Rob, if you could describe ISPOR's value flower, and if this is a kind of spin off of quality, if it's similar to what ICER's doing, or maybe just give kind of an overview of what that is, if you would.
So I want to say maybe a couple things here. Firstly, for your listeners, uh, at the end of 2023 and into early 2024, ISPOR developed and released a new strategy for the society as a whole. It's our 2030 strategy. And I'm mentioning that because, firstly, I'd like as many of your listeners as possible to go to the ISPOR website and have a look at it. But I'm also mentioning it because it really is anchored by two goals. One of those goals has a lot to do with ISPOR becoming, the trusted HEOR authority that is helping to shape health policy globally. The other goal has a lot to do with value. And this is where the value flower, I think, is important and relevant because we know that value means many, many different things to many different stakeholders. If you're a health economist, you think about value in a particular way. If you're an investor, you think about value maybe in a slightly different way. And if you're a patient, you think about it in a very different way as well. The value flower attempts, and using the metaphor of the petals on the flower, it attempts to, tease out what are these dimensions of value. And from that perspective, it's been, I think, an incredibly important intellectual and pedagogic contribution to the field. In practice, the reality is that as health economists, we have tended to think about value quite narrowly. And we know that if we talk to patients or we talk to people that aren't currently a patient, we hear things like, well, what matters most to my health is access to affordable housing, access to nutritious food, social networks and connection, employment, some pretty foundational fundamental things. And again, our conception of health and our conception of value in health has been much more narrowly focused. So it's been focused around quality adjusted life years, for instance. And what we're wanting to do increasingly is say, well, wait a second, how do we factor in some of these things that patients and people are telling us matter to them? So the value flower, is important, and we are very deliberately wanting to, undertake the work, and we're doing that right now at ISPOR. We're undertaking the work to expand and broaden our definition of value, to explicitly reference what is now, I think, increasingly and popularly referred to as whole health.
Right.
So, health beyond the purely physical, and health, beyond simply the treatment of a particular disease.
You mentioned the real world evidence conference coming up in Tokyo at the end of this month. But what else is on your agenda, Rob, at ISPOR? What are your top priorities for the rest of this year and maybe the start of next year?
So I'm really really excited about the fact that we have our European conference coming up very very shortly as well. So we're in Tokyo at the end of September for a real world evidence summit. And in mid-November, we'll be in Glasgow, Scotland for our annual European conference. And this is the important thing about these conferences. So we have an annual North American conference and an annual European conference at present. These are the largest conferences in the world for health economics and outcomes research professionals and those with an interest in HEOR. So I'm really, really excited about that because it's an opportunity to bring the community together and welcome those that are new to health economics and outcomes research and new to ISPOR. But I think what excites me most though is that we're on a journey right now where I think it's fair to say we've acknowledged that for most of its 30-year history, ISPOR was focused on the definition of the field and the articulation of methods and so forth. And that was necessary. Now, increasingly, we want to drive increased awareness, use, and impact of health economics and outcomes research. And that means we need to be stepping into the policy arena in ways that we haven't done as much historically. And that's what really excites me because honestly, on the back of every ISPOR business card, it says improving healthcare decisions. Well, the only way we're going to improve healthcare decisions is if we're actually engaging with decision makers and bringing our evidence to bear and helping they in their capacities, make better, more informed decisions grounded in data and evidence. And at the same time, what really excites me is the possibility to have conversations like this and through, your listeners, reach new audiences and help them, become aware of ISPOR firstly, and hopefully too, help them understand that, hey, I'm an early stage biotech or I'm a late stage biotech and I have questions about the value of my product and how I communicate that value. Well, this is where ISPOR can help. We have a real interest in helping early stage companies especially grow and collapse some of the barriers that are in front of them as they seek to get to market. or indeed seek to be acquired. So, for me, there's just a real excitement around having that impact on health policy, but also having that impact on stakeholders within the healthcare ecosystem.
Rob, we have covered a lot of topics during this hour. You've been a really good sport, and I very much appreciate that. I know that this conversation is going to be valuable, the operative word for this conversation to our listeners. You've already given some, I think, excellent advice, but I just want to maybe end with, are there any final messages that you would like to leave with our listeners thinking of startups, early stage companies who are looking for ways to grow their business and get medicines, excuse me, to the patients that need them?
So thank you, Ben. It's been a real pleasure for me to be part of this conversation. And I would say to the early stage companies, especially, you heard me say it early in the conversation, so I'll bookend it now. Think beyond the approval. There's a real difference between demonstrating efficacy and demonstrating value. And so you need to think beyond the approval and understand that the investor in particular, but partners as well, are interested in, adoption, reimbursement, and that flow of return. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I really want, listeners to understand that health economics and outcomes research can sound or appear to be a rather dry and arcane topic. But this is ultimately about how we deliver a greater patient experience. All of us have been patients or will be patients at some point in our lives. All of us know people that are patients or will be patients. And so it's in our self-interest to improve the healthcare system to the best of our abilities and make it accessible so it's there when we need it. Make it effective so we actually get what we need. Make it efficient. Hey, I'm an economist. I look for efficiency, but I also care passionately about affordability. And so, what ISPOR is continually animated by is this quest for accessibility, effectiveness, efficiency, and affordability. And we're a big tent. And I want to make that tent bigger. So anyone who's listening, I want them to know that the door is always open at ISPOR, and I welcome anyone that wants to reach out to me or any of my staff to learn more about ISPOR and health economics and outcomes research.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's been a real pleasure, Ben. Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Rob Abbott, CEO at ISPOR. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at Life Science Leader. We'll see you next week, and thanks as always for listening.